There we go. All right, so we're in Unit 4. So that you know, there are 4 chapters. Chapter 1 is called Energy Flow in the Biosphere. So in Chapter 1, we are going to focus on energy, so where energy goes and what energy does. In Chapter 2, we'll focus on matter, so actual atoms, and then so on. So each chapter has a slightly different slant on ecology and evolution. In Chapter 1, there are 3 lessons and a chapter assignment, just so that you know where things are headed. And we are going to do Lesson 1. So Lesson 1, as part of energy flow in the biosphere, will have quite a bit to do with the laws of thermodynamics. And the laws of thermodynamics shouldn't be new to you, because you had to take Science 10 to be in this class, and you had to have at least heard about them, even if you forget what they are. So we're going to start with maybe a bit of review, just to remind you of some ideas and some concepts that you probably have already heard about, but that we're going to use in this chapter, so we need to make sure you're on top of it. So the first reminder that I have here is, what is the biosphere? Chances are you heard about this at some point. The biosphere is really anywhere life exists on Earth. Now, typically, we would take the biosphere, where life exists, and we would split it into 3 parts. We would split it into atmosphere, which is the air, lithosphere, which is the land, and hydrosphere, which is the water. So these 3 parts make up the biosphere. So since organisms can live in water, or on land, or in the air, all 3 of those are part of the biosphere. Now in Science 10, you did a lot of specific, probably, discussion about those. I know I do with my class. That's not our goal. I just want you to recognize what the word atmosphere, lithosphere, and hydrosphere means, so that we can use them appropriately when we're talking about things in other questions. The other thing that I want to remind you of is this. Except for meteorites, which is where things from space land on our planet, we have had the same material on our planet for, as far as we can tell, billions of years. So the atmosphere hasn't changed in terms of the actual atoms that are there. Sure, things have changed in terms of what's in the atmosphere as compared to what's in land or what's in water. But the atoms that make up our planet really are not different. I know one of the things I always tell, especially when I'm doing this in grade 10, I tell people to think about, is to think of someone famous that you would just die to meet. And if they live in the northern hemisphere, it's very probable that at some point you have breathed in a molecule of oxygen that they have breathed in. So sometimes, if I'm having myself a bad day, I think, hey, maybe right now is the moment that I'm breathing a bit of Matthew McConaughey air right in my lungs. It makes me feel a little bit better. And it would be true for people that lived in the past too. So it's very probable that living in the northern hemisphere, you might breathe some air that Einstein breathed, or that Picasso breathed in, or that a famous king or ruler in Europe breathed in as well. You might be breathing in some Hitler air. You're probably not excited about that, but I'm just saying we have the same material on Earth. It's just getting recycled all the time. So this is the biosphere. The next thing that we need to remind you of are, what are the laws of thermodynamics? The first law of thermodynamics is the law that says essentially what this picture is showing. If I'm going to change energy somehow, whatever energy I have before and whatever energy I have after have to be equal, like this little scale is showing. So the law really says, if I sum it up, energy in to a system has to equal energy out of a system. Now, when I say a system, that could be a number of things. A human organism is actually a bunch of systems put together. A food chain could be considered a system. Our planet could be considered a system. Another way to word the first law of thermodynamics is this: energy cannot be created or destroyed, but its form can change. So you might have heard at some point the law of conservation of mass. I know in chemistry that's something that we talk about a lot. You can't have more mass at the end of a chemical reaction than you had at the beginning. And the same is true for energy. Energy does not come from nowhere. Sometimes it looks like there's no energy because it's being stored. And so we'll just take a second and talk about some examples of in biology where energy is stored. A really good example is what happens in photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, we make glucose. We know that from previous lessons. Since glucose is where I took a bunch of small molecules and made a big one, so I made a big carbohydrate, there is chemical energy in that molecule. So even though it doesn't look like the plant is actually doing anything, the fact that the plant took the sun's energy and turned it into something else, that's stored energy. In general, chemical energy is stored. And then when the animal eats that glucose, then they can use that energy and change into another type of energy. So that's a really good example of stored energy. We could also talk about the molecule ATP, which we already know about. ATP, adenosine triphosphate, has energy stored in the bonds to the phosphate groups. So this unit is actually going to afford us a really nice chance to review a little bit about photosynthesis in particular. So those are some specific examples, biologically speaking, where energy can be stored. If we think sort of on a bigger scale in humans, we could talk about fat cells storing energy. Some of you might be aware that it's incredibly difficult to get rid of fat once you have it, and that's because fat cells have a really slow metabolism and there's a bunch of energy stored there that could possibly be used. So you cannot create or destroy energy, but you can change its form. So perhaps it's stored and not being used, but it's still there. Does anyone have questions about the first law of thermodynamics? So that's the first law. The second law builds off of the first law. So this is still true. Energy before and energy after have to be equal, but we're going to add something to that idea. In the second law of thermodynamics, if you look at the picture, we still have a balance, but we're being more specific about the energy after. What we're saying is that when energy goes through a transformation, some of the energy at the end is maybe unusable. It's not a form that the organism, because this is biology, the organism can actually use. So the law says basically no energy transformation is 100% efficient. We would generally say energy is wasted You might see in some texts people say energy is lost, and I would prefer that we not use that word because that insinuates that it has disappeared. But energy is wasted, and it's usually wasted as heat. So quite frequently, when energy changes from one form to another, I get some heat produced kind of as a byproduct. So that's not the goal, that's not the type of energy that the organism or the machine was going for, but some is produced nonetheless. Now I say usually because sometimes heat is the energy that we're going for. So that's not a steadfast rule, but biologically speaking, it will be the type of energy that is wasted most of the time. So at the bottom, I'll just describe some biological examples of energy conversions that produce heat. A really good one is a muscle contraction. You know from previous chapters that your muscles contracting is one of the ways that you can thermoregulate. So shivering, which is tiny little muscle contractions, generates heat. And that's because of cell respiration. In the reaction for cellular respiration, we take our oxygen and our glucose. They react to produce CO2, water, ATP, and heat. Heat is always one of the byproducts, and in fact, in most chemical reactions, some sort of heat is produced. Another really good example, biologically speaking, that produces heat is decomposition. So when something has died and material is being broken down and decomposed, decomposition produces quite a bit of heat. Now that only seems like two little examples, but perhaps I'll just remind you that all your body systems and all the body systems of any organism that has muscles of any kind depend on muscle movement. And so just saying muscle contraction, it doesn't mean only say when you're running. This could mean when you're digesting. This could mean when you're breathing. This could mean when sphincters are opening and closing without you even being in control of it. Any muscle contraction at all produces a little bit of heat, even if it's involuntary. So basically that means we are producing waste heat all the time. Virtually everything we do produces a little bit of waste heat. Now, does anyone have any questions about the first or the second law of thermodynamics? Why don't you put up your hand if you're like, yeah, I think I heard about those one time. Okay, so even if you forgot the rules, you've heard about them before, which is good. We'll just take a little pause here. So the next thing sort of on our list is to talk about how energy would get transferred, especially the difference between heat energy, which is probably the thing you're familiar with, and energy within a food chain, which will be the thing really that we're focusing on because this is biology. The first thing that we'll talk about is how heat is transferred. Heat, which is the sort of wasted or not usable energy, can be transferred by conduction. Conduction is direct contact. So on the little picture over there, there's a person holding a fire poker thing, but they've got a glove on, and that's because they're directly touching the fire poker, which is getting heated up, and the heat could be directly transferred from the fire poker to their hand. Convection has to do with fluids, so either water or air, typically. So convection is when heat is transferred through a current. So it could be like the picture is illustrating, you can feel the heat of a fire even though you're not directly touching the fire, and that's because the air between you and the fire is being warmed. It could also be through water, and although the picture isn't showing that, you might remember learning in Science 10 that water currents help transfer heat from the equator around to the rest of the globe. Radiation, I'm going to put a little star next to. Even though heat is the non-useful energy, and we're trying to focus on the biology part, radiation is the one of these three that we actually see every time we take a look at a food chain, because radiation is how the sun transfers energy. So we would call them waves that are coming from the sun, or rays like UV rays, UVA rays, UVB rays. But since the sun transmits energy through radiation, and really anything that's using waves does that, radiation is the one that we'll see as part of food chains, because the majority of food chains begin with the sun being absorbed by a plant so that it can do photosynthesis. Now, after these three, I put the word biosphere because we're really talking about how is heat transferred around air and land and water. Another way that you can transfer energy that maybe hasn't been one you've discussed a lot is the idea of chemical molecules. In other words, a food chain. In a food chain, animals are not getting energy from the level below them through conduction, which is something that I think people misinterpret. They think, oh, since conduction is direct contact and a lion directly touches a gazelle, that must be how it's getting its energy. But the lion cannot walk up to the gazelle and just do this and acquire energy. The lion has to eat the gazelle, digest the molecules that the gazelle was made out of, and use those chemical molecules like ATP, like fat, etc., like glucose. So the three that we mentioned earlier, those are ways that energy is passed in a food chain. So if I ask you on an assignment or on a test, how is energy getting from one level of the food chain to the next? Unless you are talking about photosynthesis, please do not tell me that it is convection or conduction. Those would be true for how heat is being transferred around in the air, in the water, even on the land, but not in a food chain. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask there? So what happens to energy? You should have learned what albedo was last year, but I will remind you. Albedo has to do with reflection. So when we ask ourselves, okay, we have the sun, which is our main source of energy. What is happening to all the energy from the sun? Where does it go? Now, albedo is the word that describes reflection. The average albedo on Earth, kind of as a rule of thumb, is 30%. So if I look at this picture over here, and I sort of add up what's going on, there's 20% over here that's being reflected by clouds. There's 6% up here that's being scattered or reflected by molecules that are in the atmosphere. And there's another 4% being reflected by the surface of our planet. So that's where the 30% comes from. So I'll just put here clouds, atmosphere, surface. Now, like with a lot of things that are number-based, of course these are just sort of rough estimates. I would expect you to know sort of the relative size, like what's the most or what's the least. Now, the other thing I have on here is reasons or causes for different albedo. We said that the average was 30, but that doesn't mean that the albedo is 30 every single place on our planet. It depends where you are and what the characteristics of that place are. Some of the reasons for different albedo, we'll put color as our number one reason. You might know, just from your personal life, that if it's hot outside, you probably shouldn't wear a black shirt because you will feel even hotter. And that's because darker colored things have a lower albedo. Other things could be texture. So for example, things that are shiny, like ice, have a higher albedo. So more of the sun's energy gets reflected. So if you think about somewhere like the North Pole, which is covered with white snow and shiny ice, more of the sun's energy is reflected. So instead of about 70% being absorbed somewhere, much less than that is absorbed somewhere like the North Pole. That means that we could put latitude, which means how close or how far you are from the equator, as another point. Now, latitude doesn't necessarily directly affect your albedo, because albedo talks about how much sun is reflected. But if you are at a greater latitude, that means you are farther away from the equator, there's less sun to absorb in the first place. So even though you might not actually be reflecting more, you're absorbing less. Now just one more point I want to make. It's not a word that I tend to use a lot, but it does show up in your textbook in at least a place or two. The word that is the opposite of albedo is insolation. And I spelt that right. I don't mean insulation, S-U-L, like the pink stuff that you put in your house. I mean insolation. S-O-L represents sun. So the opposite of how much is being reflected is how much is being absorbed, and we're talking about the sun. So if you're ever trying to say the opposite of albedo, you can use the word insolation. So I just have a couple of examples to illustrate to you the type of place that would have a high albedo and the type of place that would have maybe a lower albedo. The type of place that would have a high albedo would be someplace like this, snow and ice covered. An example of a place with a low albedo would be something like this, a dark, dense forest. Now, of course, there are other examples of places that would have a high albedo. A sandy desert would be another one. And sometimes people don't think about the desert as being a good reflector because it's hot in the desert. But so that you know, not all deserts are hot, and they're not hot all the time. Sand has a really low heat capacity. That means that it changes temperature quickly, plus it's light colored, plus it's generally fairly reflective. And so a sandy desert would have a pretty high albedo. Lots of sun is being reflected. Obviously, the icy snow-covered place would be a good example. I'm going to put the word water here. Water isn't really a 100% answer, but you might know, for example, that it is very likely that you would get a sunburn if you go out, say, rafting or boating on water on a bright sunny day, because the sun will be reflected off of the water. And so even though water can absorb a lot of heat, it can also reflect a lot as well. And so water would have a fairly high albedo, maybe not as high as white shiny ice, but it still does do quite a bit of reflecting. Other things that would cause high albedo would be any sort of pollution or dust in the atmosphere. So think about perhaps an area that's really industrialized, if there's lots of particles in the atmosphere, less sun is going to get through, more of it will get reflected. It could happen because of, say, an explosion. It could be a volcano erupting. It could be the aftermath of a meteorite hitting the Earth, and that stirs up a bunch of stuff. But anything that's causing extra particles to be in the atmosphere could be another one. Now in the low albedo section, I do want to write the word plants. Plants purposefully absorb the sun. So anywhere there are a lot of plants, there is usually a fairly low albedo because the plants will absorb as much sun as they possibly can. That doesn't mean albedo would be 0, just that if there are plants or any other type of producers, then the albedo is probably lower than that same place with less producers. Anywhere that's dark in terms of soil color, so not a white sandy beach, but maybe a dark field that's just been plowed, that would be pretty good at absorbing sun as opposed to reflecting it. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask there? So what we need to do next is focus a little bit on energy storage. We already know about photosynthesis, but what we don't know a lot about is chemosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the way most food chains work, but there are some food chains that cannot rely on the sun. So I've made a little chart here to compare what's going on, and I'm going to highlight the things that I think you need to know. In a photosynthetic food chain, the source of energy is the sun. In a chemosynthetic food chain, the source of energy isn't the sun, but is a hydrothermal vent. So that means photosynthesis, where photo means light, is where we're making a molecule by using light energy. Chemosynthesis, where chemo means chemistry or chemical molecule, is where we're making a molecule by using chemical energy and heat that is coming from this vent at the bottom of the sea. So there is no sun available in a chemosynthetic food chain. The next thing that I think that we would want to look at is, what is the producer? In a photosynthetic food chain, the producer would be a green plant, a plant that is absorbing the sun's light. In a chemosynthetic food chain, the producer is generally these little bacteria that live on tube worms. So the white and red things are the tube worms, and they will have bacteria living on them. So I'll just jot that down. So the source is different, the producer is different. Then we'll focus on what they need, so what the reactants are. And what they produce, so what the products are. Now, if you take a look at what's there, you'll see that instead of writing glucose, I wrote carbohydrate. And that's because all carbohydrates can be converted to glucose with a couple of steps. So if I look at the photosynthesis side, you already know this. CO2 and water are the reactants. A carb, so glucose, and oxygen are the product. I'm going to highlight some things that are different. On the chemosynthesis side, CO2 and water are still the reactants, but so are hydrogen sulfide, and so is oxygen. So it's weird that oxygen is a reactant and not a product. The other thing that's different, I still get a carb being produced, but I also get sulfuric acid being produced. So even though both of these things have as their goal to produce a carbohydrate, the way that they're doing it is different. Now I put just as a side note here, only 1 to 2% of the sun's energy is actually used by producers. The rest is absorbed or reflected or scattered at some other point in the atmosphere. So it's really quite amazing that all life on Earth kind of starts with only 1% of the sun's energy. It's really quite fantastic.